Good afternoon, Virgo. Unconditional means without conditions, no requirements, no prerequisites, no earning necessary. Love that exists regardless of behavior, regardless of reciprocation, regardless of whether you meet unstated expectations hidden beneath claim of unconditionality. Except humans don't love unconditionally, can't neurologically wired for conditional attachment, for pattern recognition, for responding to treatment received, for withdrawing from sources of repeated pain, for protecting self when relationship becomes harmful. That's not failure of love. That's survival mechanism working correctly. That's healthy boundary function. That's organism prioritizing self-preservation over romantic ideal that sounds beautiful but operates dangerously when attempted. So when someone promises unconditional love, when they claim desire to love without conditions, they're promising something they fundamentally cannot deliver. Not because they're lying, because unconditional love between humans is fiction, fantasy, concept that sounds appealing until you examine what it would actually require. Would require accepting abuse without withdrawing, would require staying present through betrayal without protecting yourself, would require loving someone who harms you repeatedly because conditions would mean love isn't unconditional anymore. That's not love. That's self-destruction with romantic label attached. Fingernails digging into palms without conscious decision to form fists. Get ready to be so happy. Command disguised as excited announcement. Instruction presented as good news. Demand that you prepare for emotional state that may or may not materialize depending on factors completely outside your control. But happiness isn't something you get ready for, isn't destination you prepare to arrive at, isn't state that happens to you when circumstances align favorably. Happiness is practice, choice, moment by moment decision to relate to present experience in specific way, regardless of whether experience contains traditionally happy-making content. Telling someone to get ready to be happy implies happiness is coming from outside. Implies once this person loves you unconditionally, once that promised relationship manifests, once that fantasy becomes reality, then happiness arrives. Then you can be happy. Then circumstances justify emotional state you've been waiting for permission to experience. But that's backwards. That's making happiness conditional on unconditional love from someone else. That's waiting for external validation to grant permission for internal experience you could choose right now independent of anyone else's supposed desires. Getting ready to be happy, as if happiness is elsewhere, coming toward you, something to prepare for rather than something to practice, regardless of relationship status. What are you preparing? What readiness looks like? What preparation means when applied to emotional state? Or is get ready just filler language designed to create anticipation, to make waiting feel purposeful, to turn passive hope into active preparation despite nothing actually being prepared? Teeth grinding together, creating pressure that serves no function. This person, specific individual, definite article, someone identifiable, someone you already know or suspect or hope is being referenced, and immediately your mind went there. Assigned identity to this person based on who you want it to be, who you need it to be, who would make the promise of unconditional love most satisfying if it came from them specifically. But that's projection. That's your desire creating specificity where vague language leaves room for interpretation. That's you doing work of making promise feel personal when really it's generic enough to apply to anyone, to no one, to figment of imagination you've constructed from loneliness and hope. This person doesn't exist until you make them exist, until you assign identity, until you decide who the promise is about. And in that deciding, in that assigning, you've already started believing something that has no foundation beyond your need for it to be true. Because what if this person isn't who you think? What if there's someone you haven't met, someone you'll never meet, someone who exists only as concept designed to activate hope without delivering substance? Then you've invested belief in empty promise. Then you've attached emotional energy to fantasy masquerading as prediction. Then you've made yourself vulnerable to disappointment that was avoidable if you'd questioned instead of immediately assigning identity to vague reference. Can you hold that? Can you sit with possibility that this person is nobody? Or does needing them to be somebody override capacity for critical examination? Shoulders carrying weight that doesn't exist in physical form but feels crushing anyway. Wants to love you. Present tense. Current desire happening now. Someone actively wanting to offer unconditional love to you specifically. But wanting isn't doing. Wanting isn't commitment. Wanting is easy, costs nothing, requires no follow-through, exists entirely in realm of intention without obligation to manifest as action. And focusing on what someone wants rather than what they're actually doing, what they're actually offering, what they're actually demonstrating through behavior, that's set up for disappointment because wants change. Wants are influenced by mood, by circumstance, by whether maintaining want feels worthwhile when faced with reality of executing it. Wants exist in ideal space where complications haven't emerged yet, where actual relationship dynamics haven't tested whether want can survive contact with messy reality of two imperfect humans attempting connection. So someone wanting to love you unconditionally, that's nice sentiment, that's pleasant intention, that's easy claim to make when love is still theoretical, still in wanting phase, still hasn't been tested by actual relationship requirements. But what happens when want meets reality, when unconditional love gets tested by your flaws, your wounds, your difficult moments? When loving you unconditionally requires something more than wanting, requires actual work, actual patience, actual choosing you repeatedly through hard parts. Does want survive that? Does wanting to love unconditionally mean they actually will when unconditional gets difficult? Or does want evaporate when reality reveals that unconditional is harder than it sounded when it was just nice idea someone was wanting? Stomach acid rising like body rejecting something it can't digest. So happy. Extreme happiness. Joy beyond normal range. Happiness so significant it requires so as intensifier to convey magnitude. And making that happiness dependent on someone else's supposed desire to love you unconditionally. Making your emotional state contingent on another person's wanting, on their following through, on relationship manifesting as promised. That's giving away power. That's making happiness something that happens to you when circumstances align rather than something you generate regardless of circumstances. That's waiting to be made happy instead of being person who creates happiness through how you relate to whatever is, including absence of promised unconditional love. Because what if they don't follow through? What if want doesn't translate to action? What if unconditional love turns out to be conditional after all, dependent on you being easy to love, on relationship being smooth, on your wounds not triggering their wounds in ways that make unconditional feel impossible. Then you've attached happiness to promise that didn't deliver. Then you've waited to be happy until condition met that won't be met. Then you've postponed choosing happiness now because you believed happiness was coming later through someone else's supposed wanting. And that postponement, that waiting, that attaching happiness to future external circumstance, that's how you miss being happy now. That's how you waste present moment, waiting for a promised moment that may never arrive. Is that cost acceptable? Is potential happiness from promised unconditional love worth actual unhappiness created by waiting for it instead of choosing happiness available right now, independent of anyone else's wanting? Ribs aching like they're trying to contain something too large for chest cavity. Unconditional love. Let's examine what that would actually look like if it existed between humans in a sustainable way. Love without conditions means love that doesn't respond to being treated poorly. Love that continues regardless of whether it's reciprocated. Love that persists through betrayal, through abandonment, through harm. Is that healthy? Is that sustainable? Is that even desirable? Or is that just staying in harmful dynamic while calling it unconditional love? Is that just refusing to have boundaries while claiming boundaries would make love conditional? Is that just accepting mistreatment because leaving would prove love had conditions after all? Because real unconditional love, if it existed, would be dangerous, would remove all incentive for treating partner well, would eliminate consequences for harmful behavior, would create dynamic where one person can do anything while other person continues loving because conditions would make love not unconditional anymore. That's not relationship. That's one person sacrificing self on altar of romantic ideal that sounds beautiful in theory but creates suffering in practice. So when someone promises unconditional love, when they claim desire to love without conditions, what are they actually promising? Healthy relationship? Or a relationship where you accept anything because holding them accountable would introduce conditions? And which do you want? Do you want unconditional love that means accepting harm? Or do you want conditional love that means boundaries exist, consequences apply, and relationship requires both people treating each other well? Because you can't have both. Can't have unconditional and healthy. Can't have love without conditions and love that protects you. Choose. But choose consciously, knowing what you're choosing. Not just accepting romantic fantasy without examining what it would actually require. Pulse visible in throat like heart relocated to wrong position. This person wants to love you unconditionally. Entire promise. Let's say it's true. Let's say someone does want exactly that. Wants to offer love without conditions, without requirements, without earning necessary. So what does that give you? What does their wanting create for you? Because their wanting is theirs. Their desire belongs to them. Their intention lives in their experience, not yours. And you making their wanting into promise for your happiness, into prediction of your emotional state, into reason to get ready for joy. That's taking something that's theirs and making it about you in ways that may not serve you. Their wanting doesn't obligate them to follow through, doesn't create your right to expect, doesn't make you entitled to receiving what they supposedly want to give. And organizing your emotional state around someone else's wanting waiting to be happy until their want manifests as action, preparing for joy that depends entirely on whether they convert wanting into doing. That's precarious. That's building on foundation you don't control. That's hoping someone else's internal state creates your happiness, when you could just be happy now without needing their want to materialize, without waiting for unconditional love to arrive, without making emotional state dependent on whether someone else follows through on supposed desire. You could choose happiness independent of anyone wanting to love you, could create joy that doesn't require external validation, could be so happy without needing to get ready for it, without waiting for it to arrive through someone else's action. But that requires giving up hope that someone else will do it for you, requires accepting that happiness is yours to create, not theirs to deliver, requires being responsible for your own emotional state instead of waiting for someone else to make you feel something. And that's harder, that's less romantic, that's less exciting than believing happiness is coming through someone else's unconditional love. But it's more reliable, more sustainable, more honest about how happiness actually works. Hands shaking like they're trying to release something but don't know how. Get ready to be so happy this person wants to love you unconditionally. Entire statement, complete promise, examined thoroughly now. And what's left? What remains when you strip away fantasy? When you examine what unconditional actually means? When you question whether wanting translates to doing? When you acknowledge that happiness based on someone else's supposed desire is happiness you don't control? What's left is choice, your choice. Choose to believe promise that can't be verified about person who may not exist wanting something humans can't actually deliver. Or choose to be happy now, to create love for yourself that doesn't wait for someone else to offer it unconditionally. Both options available, both choices possible, but only one gives you power. Only one makes happiness something you control. Only one stops endless waiting for external circumstances to grant permission for internal state you could choose regardless. So choose. But choose knowing what you're choosing, knowing what each option costs, knowing where power sits in each scenario. And if you choose to believe, if you choose to wait, if you choose to get ready for happiness that depends on someone else's unconditional love, at least own that choice. At least acknowledge you're choosing hope over agency. At least admit you're waiting for someone else to do what you could do for yourself right now. Because owning the choice, seeing it clearly, understanding costs, that's different from believing blindly, from hoping without examining, from waiting without questioning whether waiting serves you or just postpones living. And maybe that ownership, that clear seeing, that conscious choosing, maybe that's what actually prepares you for happiness, not getting ready for someone else to deliver it, but recognizing you've had access all along to create it yourself. Truth isn't found in others' stories. It's discovered in your own silence. No predictions, just presence. Stay curious, stay awake.